actually, while we're having a few minutes just to let other people catch up with us, perhaps I could pose a question for everybody to start our brains whirring away, especially if it's early morning, wherever you are, might be useful. So my question to you is, what words would you use to describe an online learning community? I'll pop it into the chat, and then just have a think about it. You don't have to write anything if you don't want to. It's just to start us thinking in the right direction today, hopefully.
Fantastic. And I think on that note, we'll get started, Angharad. So it's my pleasure to welcome everyone. I can see the number is continuing to go up. We've got just over 70 participants joining us. I can already see lots of activity in the chat, and I can see some names I recognize as well from the past few webinars. So thanks to everyone for joining us on this learning journey. I'm super excited to announce this topic that we're going to be working through today, learning for the social age, the conditions we can create to help online learning communities thrive. And this is in direct response to some of the questions we've been seeing in the chat over the last few webinars about how to make sure people are learning together, how to make sure, you know, online learners stay motivated, and that opportunity to actually learn from each other, even when we're learning remotely. So I'm really excited to work through this webinar with everyone today. So I want to, for those of you who don't know me, my name's Lisa. I'm a learning advisor at the Humanitarian Leadership Academy, and we've been running this webinar series. This is our 5th now. We've been running this webinar series in response to COVID-19 as we adapt to this new environment of working online, and especially looking at how we can continue to support learning online. And it's my great pleasure to welcome Angharad from Sea Salt.
Hi everybody, it's really lovely and my pleasure to be here with you today. I'm what we call a crewmate at Sea Salt Learning, and my particular speciality is in the development sector and the humanitarian sector. Our work at Sea Salt Learning ranges from focusing on learning directly through to things like leadership, cultural transformation, innovation and change. We work with organizations looking for that transformational piece. We're founded on the work by Julian Stodd. He is a writer, an artist, an explorer is perhaps the best term to describe him. And all of his work is founded in the context of what we call the social age, which I'll touch on a little bit more once we get started here today. But just to say thank you very much for having me.
Fantastic, thanks so much. Now we want to make sure that this is a participatory webinar. We have chosen a webinar setting, which means you might notice you don't have any audio or video. So we really want to find alternative ways for us to hear from you and for you to also learn with each other. So please use the chat to introduce yourselves. I'm already seeing lots of hellos. Drop in there where you're based and maybe even your role. It would be fantastic for us to know more about you. Use the polls to share. We'll be dropping some links into the chat box as we go along. So please do participate if you're able to, so that we can learn more. If you're new to Zoom, you'll find this little toolbar at the bottom of your browser. It might look slightly different if you're joining on a mobile phone. There you have the chat function. It might be under a ... You can say hello to other people in there. If you want to ask us a question, so myself and Angharad, please use the Q&A, and then we'll try either and respond as we go, or we might save up some questions. And then we'll be able to answer them at different pauses. I want to let you know the session is being recorded. This is so that you can watch it after. It will be saved on the Kaya course page, and of course no sort of voices or faces will be recorded. We try and ask for active listening. Now, this is something everyone is adapting to as we're no longer in a face-to-face meeting. And I know it can be super tempting to have your phone and your email and many browsers open at the same time. So we encourage you, you've committed to this 1 hour, to try and stay online, not answer those emails, but stay with us. And one thing I'm also super excited to announce is after this webinar, I'm going to encourage you to claim your badge. So this is an badge or an e-certificate. Thank you so much to everyone who's reached out over the past few weeks to request this. We've worked hard behind the scenes to design a special badge which reflects the type of learning that you can get from a webinar. So I'm going to be encouraging you to claim your badge after this webinar. Last thing, if you're an active tweeter on Twitter, that's our little, I think it's called a handle or a hashtag. So please do go ahead and join. And I can see we've got about 85 participants. Everyone's saying hello to each other, which is fantastic. I'm going to start with a quick poll before I hand over. So you should be seeing a poll on your screen right now. It might take a moment. There we go, launch polling. So if you're able to just have a quick click, this is really good for us to understand where everyone is in the world. Time zones obviously put a potential bias on who is joining us from where, but that's why we record it as well. But it's great to see who's joining us today. So I can see that 55 people have voted. I'm going to wait another maybe 10 seconds to see if we can get that up.
You'd have to be so committed to join from the Americas at this time.
I know. We have had a few people at 1 or 2 a.m., which is very impressive. Okay, I can still see the number going up. We've got 65 people who voted out of a potential 89. All right, I'm going to give it 5 more seconds. Still going up, great. And if you can't access this poll, you might be doing this on a phone, please just drop your answer in the chat about where you're joining us from. Okay, I'm going to end polling and then share the results. You should be able to see that. So that's fantastic. We've got a really strong representation in Asia, and I'm sorry for my sort of generalization. We have limited answers that we can choose from in Zoom. So I wanted to list many places, but we ended up with quite wide regions. So it's fantastic to see a good spread from Asia, Africa, Europe, Middle East, but welcome to everyone who is joining us today. And do please keep using the Q&A box and the chat function to talk and to reach out to us as we go along. Without further ado, Angharad, it would be fantastic to hand over to you. So I'm just going to close down that poll.
Thanks, Lisa. Great. Jump into the agenda for today. I'm just going to start the day, or start this session, by mentioning a couple of things. First of all, I really enjoy being heckled on these sort of events, people being able to call out loud. Of course, it's not actually feasible with the high numbers that we've got on today's call, but just use that chat function and the Q&A function to do the same, to call out if you've got anything you'd like to say or any questions you'd like to ask. And every now and again, I'll pause and ask Lisa just to let me know if there's anything that you'd like me to look at in particular. The other thing that it's worth me saying, some of you might have guessed from my name, Angharad, that I'm Welsh. And I have a little bit of a tendency when I get excited about a topic to talk very quickly. So if I start doing that, feel free to mention in the chat that I need to slow down and stop being quite so excited. Otherwise, I'm going to delve straight into our topic today, which is one that's really close to my heart. So what we're looking at today, we're going to start off by talking about the social age and what on earth we mean by that term. And then to think about, well, what is social learning, and how perhaps is it different from the more formal learning that a lot of us would have been used to. Then we'll spend a little bit of time as learning practitioners thinking about, well, what does scaffolded social learning look and feel like? Both from the perspective of if you're a learning designer, or potentially maybe a facilitator or a trainer in your role, and also from a learner's perspective as well. What does it feel like to be in a scaffolded social learning journey? And then finally at the end, we're just going to look at some really practical techniques that might help us to better enable social learning, to help our online learning communities to thrive. So I hope that agenda sounds intriguing and interesting to you. It's fair to say that I haven't come here today with a set of answers to give you. No one's found the silver bullet yet for the most effective way to learn. But what I hope to do is just potentially offer a different lens through which to view the future of learning. And what I can definitely do is offer a few techniques to support online learning communities. Having said that, there's a huge amount of expertise joining us on this call today. And so perhaps we could start off by tapping into that expertise a little bit. So Lisa, if you go to the next slide, there's a question here. And what I'd like us to do is use a platform called Menti, which some of you might have used on a previous webinar. And it's a place where we can all collaborate on our answers and share our thoughts. It's anonymous in terms of your answers, but it's a great way to be able to share your reflections with people. So we go to www.menti.com, or I think Lisa will actually just put a direct link into the chat. And then we'll share our screen for Menti. It'll ask you for a code if you use the normal link and not if you use the direct one. And once you're there, so Lisa, I might ask if we can maybe move over to Menti. I can do it, or happy for you to do it. It's lovely. You'll see a question that says, what effective approaches to online learning have you experienced? And then Lisa, if I could maybe take the screen back, I'll be able to show everybody's answers. That would be great. Thanks. If anyone's having any problems accessing Menti, then my suggestion is just to put your answer into the chat and not worry about it too much. And just bringing up my shared screen. Here we go, we've got some answers coming through already. Gamification, perhaps a very popular topic at the moment, and I think even the focus of next week's webinar maybe. Interacting directly with other participants, interactive, yeah, we're seeing that coming through often. Peer-to-peer learning. Downloadable or offline accessible materials, which is so particularly important perhaps in our sectors, where accessibility to technology needs to be really paramount consideration when we're designing and delivering any kind of learning experience. This idea of blended learning is coming through as well, which I think is increasingly being relied upon now when we're seeing new learning opportunities emerge. Some really excellent ideas coming through. And what we'll be able to do is actually download these at the end of the webinar and share them in the same place that the recording will be shared. So you'll have access to all of this knowledge and expertise on effective approaches to online learning.
It's worth saying that this is a great free tool online to get people's input, and that you can see everyone else's input at the same time. So we use this Menti tool quite a lot.
I feel like I should have had a conversation with Menti at the very beginning of my career and mentioned to them what a strong advocate I'd become for using their platform. Okay, I'm going to leave that open for a while, and then I will download the results at the end to be able to share with you. But for now, perhaps we'll come back to our presentation for today and delve into a little bit around social learning and whether or not that's an effective pathway to online learning. So for me, I want to premise today by briefly touching on the context of our work at CSALT Learning. And I've mentioned this before, this idea that we're now living in the social age, and that the social age is characterized by the world of constant change that we live in today. The rate and the pace at which we see change happening is really, very much quicker perhaps than we've experienced in the past. Some of the fundamental components of the social age is a sense of connectivity. We're radically connected at a scale we've never seen before, with huge networks that we're able to nurture and support online. And for the most part, these connections exist beyond the control of any organization that we might be working for. We have a lot more ownership over our networks and over our connections. Similarly, what we've seen in the social age is highly accessible and democratized technology. So in the past, perhaps when you started in a new role, you would sit at a desk where you would be given on loan access to a computer, perhaps a phone, and some other technology and devices. Whereas today, a lot of us own multiple devices, and we have a lot more control over the technology that we're using and the ways in which we're using it. Now, these changes have had a huge impact on the way that learning is designed and delivered, but most importantly, it's had a really big effect on the ways in which we learn. So if we jump to the next slide, Lisa, what we can see now is that learning can be increasingly co-created. It's no longer designed centrally and distributed to the masses. It's highly contextualized, so a learner can expect their experience to be very relevant to both the time and the place in which they're working. It can be facilitated by a huge number of evolving technologies. We've already mentioned some of those in that Menti that we just saw then. And increasingly, it's virtual and online. It can be very much personalized to our own ecosystem. So we can pick and choose what we're exposed to as learners more and more. We can decide what content is relevant for us, share it with others that we think it would be relevant for, and wrap it up in our own context. This does pose the question, well, are organizations keeping up with this pace of change? Organizational approaches to learning are perhaps lagging behind slightly in the reality of learning itself. In the social age, technology allows us to access information and, importantly, make sense of it in our communities ever faster and more collaboratively than before. Whereas organizational practices and organizational approaches to learning tend to often still rely on codified learning, holding knowledge centrally and distributing it. So deciding what it is that somebody needs to learn and the way in which they'll learn it. But today we're painting a picture of social learning, and that's founded on things like co-creation. It's encompassing social validation and opportunities for sense-making. It's definitely enabled by technology, but it's fundamentally about communities. Now, why communities? Well, if we have a look at the next slide, communities are our sense-making entities. That makes them entirely crucial for the way that we learn. They sort and filter information. They provide us with challenge and feedback. They're often the ones who help us to maintain our momentum. They're responsible for connecting us to new sources of knowledge, and importantly, knowledge that we trust. They challenge our preconceptions. They turn to us for help, and they're there when we need help in return. So social learning is a way of harnessing the power of communities to scaffold more effective learning. I'm going to pause there just for a second to see if there are any questions that Lisa wants to put forward. And the next then we'll have a look at, well, what is social learning?
Thanks, Angharad. Nothing popping up actually. I think everyone is focused on your wonderful presentation skills at the moment. So, well, but I really encourage, like you said, people to shout out their similar experiences in the chat or their questions in the Q&A.
Absolutely, thanks. It's nice just to hear a different voice every now and again anyway, Lisa. Okay, so we'll go to the next slide. What is social learning anyway? Well, let's start by thinking about it in comparison to formal learning. So on this slide, what we can see are formal learning is in that center place. Now, formal learning is anything that we might do in a classroom It's anything that's wrapped up in modules, in workbooks. It's contained in these formal elements. It's any type of learning that's written, designed, and delivered by the organization. It's what many organizations rely on to get us to learn stuff when they've got a particular topic or a particular skill in mind that they want us to learn. Social learning is about the conversations that surround this. So social learning is about the wisdom of the community and the wealth of experience that this wisdom is founded upon. It's about helping each other to learn, building learning networks that we can rely on during that actual learning opportunity, so during the training, for example, but beyond that as well, that network extends for us. It's about solving problems together, and it's about sharing and co-creating stories. What it allows us to do is bring together everything you already know alongside what everybody you know also knows. So creating social learning opportunities within an organization is about creating a learning journey that incorporates the formal and the social. So both elements are important. We're not saying that we're going to remove formal learning entirely, but that we're trying to complement it with this social learning approach. Because social learning happens anyway, all the time. It's any time that someone asks, how do I do this? Or what does this mean? Or what do you think about this? And what should I do about it? But as an organization, and as learning designers and deliverers, we can encourage and support it. We can design learning to be social. We can create the conditions where social learning can thrive. It won't happen without very careful consideration. It takes careful design and careful delivery. But the really interesting thing about social learning is that it's also ultimately about letting go of some of the control that we typically hold over learning. So on this next slide, we're looking in particular at scaffolded social learning. Now, scaffolded social learning is about creating experiences to explore. It's not about creating events to attend. So we create a series of spaces and assets that the community uses in a structured way. So there's still structure, there's still a curriculum, but there's also spaces to co-create, to sense make. Co-creation is really the magic at the heart of social learning. It's that process of consuming formal elements of learning. So what the organization tells us we need to learn, and then having the opportunity to talk it over, working out what it means for me as a learner within my context, and transforming it into a new story together. So let's put it into a real life example. Let's say that we wanted to create a course on hygiene and sanitation in flood-prone rural communities. This course tells people what are good hygiene practices, and it teaches people the skills to manage sanitation during a flood. Or in a scaffolded social learning approach, perhaps instead we ask them to write, to co-create the story. What type of hygiene and sanitations do they think they're needing at this time? And how might it be possible to practice them? They're co-creating that story together. We can still provide the formal assets, these islands in the river that you can see. This is the what we want them to learn parts of a learning program. But alongside that, we structure conversations. These are the refuge on the shore around what do they already know and think. So we as the learning provider still have a voice in the conversation, but more importantly, so does the community. What we're bringing together in this scaffolded approach is the best of formal knowledge, the best of the formal learning that we've relied upon historically, and the best of the tribal community-based knowledge that we've got access to. So again, I can pause there.
Thanks, Angharad, and some really fantastic questions coming up that I'm super excited to share with you. Can I maybe give you 3 and see how you're fixed to answer?
You can try. I can't promise my brain will process all 3, but I'll take some notes.
So from Zohir Bitter, apologies if I mispronounced that. How does social learning differ from one society to another? From Joy Muller, how do you define a community for online learning? In terms of if it's too limited, it might reduce knowledge sharing. So how to define that? And then what are your thoughts on the job learning compared to sort of social learning or formal learning? And that's just a quick selection. I'm really happy to see lots of questions coming through.
And I think that it's actually possible to almost combine some thinking around those first 2 questions. And I'm just going to reiterate again, I'm not here to bring you the answers, although I think that those are excellent questions to pose. So how do these differ from one society to the other? Well, the wonderful thing about that is that, of course, that's entirely up to your community. In the same way that, how do we define a community? Well, I would argue that it's actually not our place to do that. I would actually suggest that it's the community's role to do that. We'll look a little bit shortly at how it is that we welcome communities and members. What are the rituals that surround our communities and how do we define them? But really, a learning community could have the opportunity to define themselves, to decide for themselves what's their purpose, what are their values, what are the different roles that people occupy within it, what are the rules for engagement within that community. And in that sense, you're not drawing a picture of what a learning community needs to look like. You're actually inviting the community to establish that for themselves. Because by allowing that space, by creating the space for that community to define its own goals and purpose, you're much more likely to see them engage in the space because there's a sense of ownership over it. It doesn't belong to the organization that set it up, it belongs to the community. And when we're thinking about on-the-job learning, for me, that's actually social learning in practice already. It's often a time where we go to a trusted colleague and ask them, how do I do something? That's social learning in practice. Trust forms a really important component of learning because learning is an opportunity for rehearsal. It's uncertain. It's not a performance space. And that's really crucial for us to be able to learn in safe spaces. And so what we tend to do is rely on our learning communities as places to share uncertainty, to seek out new knowledge and new skills that we need, because we trust them to hold us safely, to not judge us for not already having the answers. And so on-the-job learning happens at all times. And whether or not you want to offer that sort of scaffolded approach to it, so that there's a little bit of structure, a little bit of that formal learning component as well. So it's just a way of blending those two.
Thanks so much. Can I throw in one more question or would you like to move ahead?
No, not at all.
There's one from Sherry Collimer, which I think is really powerful. How can we promote social learning if students are limited to asynchronous learning due to lack of internet access in this time of crisis? So asynchronous is when they're not learning together at the same time. This webinar is live, so we're all online at the same time, so it's synchronous. Asynchronous would be you might have an email and you might not be responding to it at the same time as you're receiving it.
And I think that, you're raising such a crucial point in general anyway, about the fact that we don't have a sustained access to technology in all of the circumstances in which we're working. And so it's so important for the community to be able to define the spaces in which they're comfortable working, and also taking into account the limitations in terms of access. So whether or not that's a limitation in terms of the technology that you can use or the time in which you can use it. And I'll talk shortly about, the role of technology in social learning. But technology isn't actually the thing. It's an enabler, but it doesn't have to be the crux of the learning. We've seen examples of running, for example, a 5-day experiment over email. So when you don't have that opportunity to share a space in real time with a group of people, instead what you can create are spaces via email, for example, that allow you to put out metacognition, cognitive orientated questions for people, and for them to reply all to answer. But the important step, if you're doing that process, would be that you're not simply collecting responses, but analysing them, interpreting them collectively, to then share that narrative back into the community. How have people responded to it? So when we're sharing stories, it's not just about pushing a story out into your learning community. It's creating the space for people to respond, reject certain parts of it, to add to it, and to recreate it for themselves so that it's owned. But I'd like to throw that open as well on the chat to everybody else. You know, we're all working in environments where we're often restricted by access to technology. So I think that if anyone has any other ideas that they'd like to share, because we can't just spend all the rest of the session on it, although I would like to, perhaps that's a good place to go to share some best practice.
Absolutely, and there's been quite a few questions asking about contextualization, and I think you really answered that as well when you're saying that this message is put out and it's for different learners to interpret in different ways.
Let's look at an example actually of what it might look like. What does scaffolded social learning look and feel like? Perhaps if we go to the next slide, might be a good place to start. So from the learner's perspective, this is about time spent in online community spaces where they come together to learn. Now, those spaces don't have to be live, and they can actually be, you know, not necessarily that everybody has to be online at the same time. What we're doing is feeding formal assets into these spaces and opportunities for co-creative activities. It's opportunities for collaborative sense making. So we might ask people to curate content based on what they already know. This is their individual story. It's really authentic. It's generally uncontested, but that's okay at this stage. So we're asking people to go out into the real world potentially and curate examples from their current context. We then ask them to share it into the community, allow other people to analyze it and to interpret it, to add bits to it, to reject certain parts of it until it's transformed into a co-created story. This is much more consensus-based. It's much more socially moderated than that uncontested individual story. You could then ask that individual to return and rewrite their own story based upon that experience of sharing that they've just completed. So learning remains quite abstract until you have opportunities to make sense of it, both individually as that process of reconciliation and reframing against your own current understanding, and collectively. So those opportunities to come together as a community and collaborate and co-create. And that gives us that much deeper, richer sense of meaning to take from our own learning. Now, there are some ideas that I can share with you on what enables social learning to take place. So perhaps we'll have a little look at those and then we'll open up for questions again. So on the next slide, I've got 3 different areas I want us to explore quickly in terms of how do we enable social learning. My first suggestion, I think, is the hardest one. Relinquishing some control. No amount of force will create successful online learning communities. The problem with using force is that it's very closely aligned to formal sanctions. It incorporates areas of high consequence. So where people might be afraid to share uncertainty or doubt, to put forward new ideas that go against the status quo. In fact, it's the exact opposite conditions that we need for learning to thrive. What we need instead are socially moderated spaces, places where it's become safe to share uncertainty, to rehearse new practices. And what this can look like in real life is a need for us to move to where learning really is, rather than seek to subvert it and control it to bring it closer to where we want it to be. So, for example, I might want learning to take place on this new platform that my organization has invested in. And so I invite people to join that space. I register them onto that system. That technology is facilitating and opening up a space for my community to grow. But the technology alone won't guarantee that communities will emerge and flourish there. Registering people on the system will result in you having a collection of people. For that collection of people to become a learning community, well, you need trust between participants, and you also need good learning design. Let's just focus on that level of trust first of all. Brings me on to my second point about earning trust and fostering safe online spaces. Now, learning communities need spaces to explore, to rehearse, to innovate. And so it's really important to establish a sense of ownership over these spaces. We can do that in lots of subtle ways. And again, it comes back to that idea of relinquishing control somewhat. So think through carefully, how are people invited and welcomed into a space? Are there any rituals of welcome? And who designed them? Were they designed by the organization or by the community themselves? When people join a space, how do they introduce themselves and why? Are there rules imposed in the spaces that we've created? And is there an opportunity for the community to be involved in writing those rules? There needs to be real clarity around who owns the conversation in these spaces, whether or not there's a permanence to the stories that are shared there. Similarly, a transparency around, well, who's watching this space and for what reason? And how will we constructively respond to dissenting voices? How will we engage with challenge and feedback? It's often difficult to understand the subtleties of the mechanisms for engagement within online spaces. We lose some of the social cues that we pick up more easily when we're in face-to-face contact. And so being explicit in these, bringing the conversation to the foreground, can be a really helpful way for that community to establish a sense of ownership and belonging. And finally, this idea of investing in social currencies. I hope that term doesn't sound too unusual for you. What I'm talking about here isn't the currency of money, but currencies of things like trust, of pride, gratitude, of respect and purpose. So we're moving beyond formal moderation of learning in these spaces, but instead allowing community moderation to emerge, allowing people to recognize the trust that they've got in one another, to demonstrate gratitude for someone who's helped them with their learning by challenging them or bringing them new knowledge, to demonstrate respect for one another. So think about how can community members offer recognition to one another for their contribution to the community and to individual learning journeys. I'm going to pause there and go back to if there's any questions.
Thanks. I'm seeing three really fantastic ones, which I'd like to summarize as well. The first one is from Emmanuel. So these social learning concepts are super exciting. Will you be exploring the tools to enable social learning too? Do you want all three?
Sure.
The second one may be a little bit more tricky, from Elpidio. Again, apologies if I'm saying these names wrong, but thank you so much for contributing. What about media noise, misinformation, disinformation when you're trying to create a learning community. And then there was one more, I think I just need to scroll down, from Mohammed Saiful Islam, who contributes to social currencies, and this idea of social currency, about earning your place. Again, that's just a quick summary. I know I've missed off some questions, but fantastic to see these all in the Q&A.
Thank you very much. Brilliant questions. If anybody would like to contribute to answering these as well, please feel free to do so in the chat. There's plenty of great expertise available around us. So yes, tools for social learning. We will share a couple of resources that we've got available. So there's a free book that you can download called the Social Learning Guidebook. And I'll make sure that we share the link to that. That's written by Julian. The Humanitarian Leadership Academy as well is hosting a architecture for scaffolded social learning. And I think Lisa can share what that website looks like, or I can share what that website looks like just at the end of the presentation today. But what that has is some guides on just how to enable social learning at every stage of learning. So right through from the design, through the delivery, even looking at how we're assessing and evaluating learning. So I hope that will prove quite useful. And in terms of any follow-up as well, I put my email address on the first slide there. If anybody wants to reach out and have a conversation about social learning in more depth, I am always available and always really excited to have those conversations. So do please just let me know. That second question about noise is fascinating. We live in such a noisy world these days. It's very difficult to find a clear signal. And that is what I think social leaders, which is a different concept that we can explore another time, do incredibly well. It's what they contribute to their communities. They cut through the noise to find clarity and to share that clarity. But communities can be really, really helpful in this sense. So it can feel as though we're inundated with information in a different way to before, where information was often locked away in libraries. It was controlled, it was peer reviewed, it was almost, before it even went out into the world, there was a sense of guarantee in terms of the validity of that knowledge. And there was a huge amount of value in that. But what we can do now, which is really exciting, is as a community, we take knowledge, we consider its relevance and its contextual applicability to us, and very quickly we iterate it and share it back. So some of this is about finding people within your communities who you trust in terms of, where your sources of information come from, and finding those networks of sharing that help you cut through some of that noise. But it's happening in a far quicker scale now. So perhaps we're not seeing the same validity of knowledge that we would have done previously when somebody was publishing a learning journal or a book, for example. It doesn't go through the same complex iterations, but we do it much quicker as a community. So community moderation of knowledge. And finding and looking around you to see, well, looking at that person's reputation, who's sharing this information with me. And as somebody who is sharing, our responsibility sits on actually wrapping up any stories that we're sharing with context, explaining to the person we're sharing it to, why do we think this is relevant and useful for you? Rather than just sharing widely, we need to share wisely. And finally, who contributes to social currencies? I think the answer is probably everyone. Every day that we're working, we're investing in social currencies. We're investing in our own reputation. So the type of authority that we earn through the reputation that we've got within our communities is really powerful. Our reputation is founded upon our actions over time. Everything that we do contributes in some way to the reputation we've got within our community. And that reputation is tied into social currencies. How much do people trust us? To how much do they respect us? You know, do we give people reasons to be grateful for what we're doing? And in the same way that people can invest social currencies in other people. So it's entirely determined by the community, both what social currency is being offered and to who. It's entirely outside of the control of an organization. That doesn't mean that the organization can't participate in offering recognition. So that can be a really exciting opportunity for the organization to say, you know, we've seen that there's recognition going on over here for somebody's contribution to this learning journey, and we would like to formalize that by offering a digital badge or even just a sense of gratitude around that contribution. I'm conscious that we've not got a huge amount of time left, so I'm going to do one last thing, which is look at some of the key considerations around social learning. So sorry, actually, Lisa, we'll just skip a few of those. Those are just emphasizing slides. That's the one, thank you. So we've touched upon it already, but let's just look a little bit more at technology and the key consideration around it. Now, who here is registered on technology that they rarely use? I certainly know that I'm registered on plenty of technology that I very rarely access, if ever. And so that should give us a clue a little bit about why technology is an important consideration for us. The internet is widely recognized as the greatest learning tool in human history, giving us the ability to share knowledge more broadly and more quickly than ever before. But technology, whilst being important, isn't the whole story. You won't get social learning to work just by buying a system. It's all about the design and the facilitation around that technology. So if an organization wants to use scaffolded social learning, you're not just investing in technology, you must invest in your people. Social technology is all around us, but it needs to work on our terms. You can't force people to use the technology that you want them to use. They will always use the technology that they're more comfortable with, the technology that they trust, the technology that they have access to. And that's why I say go to where the learning is already happening. Don't try and force the learning to come into your space. How do we earn engagement? I use that term earn very deliberately because it is something that we have to earn. We can't demand it. So some of it comes back to the idea of stepping back, of relinquishing control. If we police and regulate social learning spaces, they just become formal ones. So people might still engage with them. That's not saying you'll lose people, but they'll probably only tell you what they think you want to hear. That's not what they're for. They're social spaces where people should be able to figure things out and share what they learn. So you can earn engagement by creating opportunities for communities to establish its own rituals and rules and purpose. You can offer clarity about the space. What's the purpose of it? How do we share? What do we share? You can feed in meaningful activities and questions into that space, especially questions that encourage metacognition behavior. So you're providing the space and those conditions for sharing. And very finally, how do we evaluate it? Such a key question in learning. And in some ways, formal assessment can still be very valid in this context. But my suggestion would be that we triangulate that formal assessment. So measuring our success from 3 different directions. Formal assessment, yes, but accompany that with self-reported learning. So a self-reported narrative. You can ask people to create a personal narrative over time. What have they learned? What are they trying out new? What worked for them? What didn't work? What do they see other people doing? And what conversations are they having about it? This is all about working out loud over time. So it's very qualitative. Self-reported narratives of learning are really qualitative, but really valid. Because if somebody can think about what have I learned and be able to express it and the way that it's changed how they work, well, that's certainly worth something. The third component to that triangulation then is that peer-reported measures. So coming back to this social currencies, because social learning happens in communities, it's really valid to explore how community members measure the value that people are bringing. So we can explore here things around how do people offer recognition related to a learning journey and incorporate that in our evaluation model. So before we open up for questions again, I'll just point out that those two resources available I mentioned, one is the Social Learning Guidebook, and the other is the Humanitarian Leadership Academy website. Oh, thank you, Lisa, for bringing it up. So if you scroll down a little, I think what you see, oh, is that a screenshot? In which case, don't worry about it. I'm very demanding, I'm sorry. So this is the site, and if we scroll down, you can see there's actually a video there from Julian talking about social learning. But right down at the bottom, there is all the architecture split into various different ways. So you've got something about the design and the delivery, you've got aspects of storytelling, you think you've got ways to incorporate games, choreography, which we've talked a little bit about with rituals, so important. So all of those tools are there to help you as well. Okay, I'm going to open
just drop that in the chat.
Thank you. Any questions now? Then I think we've got a few minutes left. Maybe we can just share some ideas or share some questions.
Fantastic. Yeah, there's been some really great engagement. I'll try and summarize a few again. A lot of interest around social currencies and some different ideas of ways to gain trust, and the idea that you can't police a space. I'm going to summarize. There's one really sort of big question, which I think it would be great to reflect on, from Japril. What are the main barriers to social learning? And also from Paul Rene, a great question, especially as we're talking so much about remote, to remember we're not only going to be remote forever. So can social learning only be done over the internet, or what about SMS? So by text messages, or back to that old brick and mortar facility, so actually face-to-face as well. So the different technologies and ways to encourage social learning. I'll leave those two with you for now.
Thank you. I would say if anyone's got technologies to share, I always think it's quite nice to let people know, especially if it's free to use. So we've used Menti today, but there's lots and lots of free technology out there to support learning. Barriers to social learning. I hope I'm not too controversial when I suggest that the organisation is perhaps the biggest barrier to social learning. We exist in the past where an organisation codified and held centrally knowledge. That was the power by which organisations were successful in many ways. By taking incredibly complex systems and simplifying them down, organizations were able to work at huge scale, at replicability. It's why you can potentially order a Starbucks coffee anywhere in the world and it comes out the same. That codification of knowledge was really, really fundamental to the development of the industrial age, for example. But it can also be a barrier now to social learning, because if we've too readily defined and narrowed down exactly what it is that we want people to learn, well, you'll be able to get people to replicate that. They'll be able to tell you what you want to hear, but you won't necessarily have built capability. And you certainly won't have allowed opportunities for invested engagement and innovation to thrive. So social learning is about acknowledging that we're not coming to that learning opportunity with all the answers. We're creating opportunities for other people to collaborate and co-create meaning around a certain topic, feeding in those formal elements, but ultimately opening up the space as well. And it certainly isn't just a technique for remote learning. It's ideally suited in many ways, but I would advocate for creating sense-making opportunities in person as much as anything. And in fact, we often do. You know, the people that we trust within our networks, who we go to when we're not sure how to do something, these are the people that are often the most helpful in making us effective in our roles. I would even argue sometimes we're most effective outside of the formal systems that the organisation creates, but perhaps that's a conversation for a different day. But we typically, if we're running a session face-to-face, which, you know, it might be quite formal and content heavy, we complement it by a follow-up sense-making session, which would be entirely informal, unstructured, and owned by that learning community.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I could stay all day and ask you questions, and I'm sure a lot of the participants could as well. There's so much great chat coming up. I'm keen to respect everyone's time. We've got 4 minutes left, so it'd be great if we could wrap up. I want to direct everyone to a couple more resources, and then I'm really hopeful that we can capture any questions that haven't been answered, and we'll drop them in our discussion board that we have on the Kaya webpage, so the course page, and we'll aim to answer them there afterwards. So what we've got here is, again, this is part of a series of webinars that we're running every week or so, given the public holidays, which tend to arise in May. The next one next week is going to be of a slightly different flavour. It's going to be a 2-hour session. It's going to be in the meeting format, so we'll actually be able to see and interact with each other. There's going to be a limited number of participants because of that format. And it's going to be for 2 hours, and we're going to actually be asking you to really participate in some type of co-creation. So really using those values that Angharad has shared with us today about how to learn from each other and to create something together. And Atish, who I'm going to be facilitating with, and myself, we're going to try and not police, well, you know, police this to an extent that it is moderated, but really allow you to come up with the design and the rules. And this is about building out a quick humanitarian game online. So you might know that the Humanitarian Leadership Academy, as well as creating free courses for humanitarians, we also create games for humanitarians. So ways to learn in scenario-based or quite emotional ways. So we're really keen to share some tools with you next week. I'm going to drop the link in the chat for that as well. And then the last thing I promised, and I'm so excited to share this with you, is about that digital badge. So you can go onto the Kaya webpage, and now you can claim your badge for this webinar. You just have to say that you attended, and we'll ask you to fill in a really quick reflections document where you take away what key messages you have from this webinar and how you might apply it in your learning. And that's so useful for us to hear, as well as a great way to kind of validate what you've taken away today. I'm going to stop screen sharing so that I can drop those links in the chat. Angharad, I don't know if you want to wrap anything up from your side.
I can just share a link to the Social Learning Guidebook, a place where you can download that for free, into the chat, just in case that proves to be useful. So that's quite a nice practical guide on some things that you can do to encourage social learning. So that's that one.
Fantastic. So I think that should be all the links. If you didn't catch them, the main one is the kayaconnect.org link, and then we'll make sure that all the other links, the guidebook, which I went through a few weeks ago and I really love, the guidebook, and even examples of the tools we've used, so Menti, and this recording will be there. So please share it with your colleagues or anyone who wasn't able to attend today. But please do sign up for the next webinar. Thank you so much for your continued engagement, and we'll leave it on the hour. So please, everyone, have a wonderful day, and thanks so much for your engagement. And big thank you to Angharad Evans from Seasalt Learning.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks so much for taking the time to be here.
Okay, bye, everyone.